I did feel after the last session and some of the questions that were there that it might be useful to begin today's session, which is all about spotting burnout in your team, with a summary really of how we can establish whether something is stress or burnout. And I explained last time that burnout is the result of ongoing stress. It's when stress has become chronic and has been continuing over time and has built up cumulatively and resulted in there being such an impact in our system and on all the different organ systems of our system that our body really can't keep going. It's not a sustainable mode for us to function in. So stress is something that's healthy. It's normal. It's a natural response that we have in day-to-day life that actually is very useful for us and beneficial to us, but not when we get stuck in a stress mode all of the time. Whereas burnout is something that, does result because we've been stuck in stress. And I spoke last time about how there can be like a build up and then something really significant happens. And that can be the thing that means that we end up burning out. But equally, it can be that build up and then it can really just be the cumulative effect. And there's a very small, tiny something that is the straw that broke the camel's back. And there's a diagram that I often find is quite useful for me to share that talks about what happens when we're in one of the fight or flight modes, the stress response modes, or and that sort of high energy where we end up feeling quite tired, but we're still wired. Or we're in a sort of lower energy state, which quite often will be referred to as either freeze or fawn. And these are hypo-arousal states, whereas fight or flight are hyper-arousal, hence the sort of higher energy and that feeling of being wired often, even though we're absolutely exhausted on the inside. Whereas when we're in freeze or fawn, we tend to withdraw mode, we withdraw more and end up in more of a shutdown mode. So freeze will often show up with people feeling very overwhelmed, their mind feeling very foggy, decision making slowing down, finding it difficult to get solutions to problems or to even work things out or to think at all. And it can start to look like somebody maybe is disengaged, but actually, just in the same way our other stress responses, it's also a self-protection mechanism. It's a survival strategy, a coping strategy. And fawn, when it gets triggered, it can show up in this and look like people pleasing or going the extra mile. And I talked last time about how often, of course, we've got societally and culturally things that have normalized exhaustion, normalized busyness, normalized tiredness, normalized. When I think about going the extra mile, think about and this comes up more in the retail industry, but like delivering things for the customer's king, going above and beyond. And but of course, we get that sense of going the extra mile that translates into many professions nowadays. So that over accommodating of requests and needs externally, finding it hard to say no, taking on too much in general, avoiding conflict. And it can look on the outside that, oh, this is a great employee, they do anything we ask of them. But underneath the surface, there can be really that sense of rising exhaustion and depletion, but it gets masked through being helpful. So I wanted to speak to that a little bit and as I say, show you this diagram that I very often use in the work that I do when I'm working one-to-one with people and in groups, and also when I'm training coaches to be able to work with burnout. So you'll see that this concept of high energy and low energy on what is really essentially a quadrant. And then that top left-hand corner, you've got that fight or flight mode. And then the bottom left-hand corner is the depletion zone, which is that fawn or freeze. Now, what happens if we are in those modes and we don't realize we're in them is we don't enable ourselves to access renewal. And renewal is on the right hand side, and it is also a low energy space, a bit like freeze or fawn, that depletion, but it's a positive low energy. So it's the space we go to when we rest, when we digest, when we sleep. It's the place that we go to when we're processing things and allowing ourselves to integrate things. It's very much supported by nature if we go outside and we're in nature, surrounded by nature. Equally, when we're indoors and we have nature in our indoor spaces through fibers that are natural or images on the wall, maybe pictures, artwork, things that are soothing for our nervous system, that are restorative for us. So renewal is something that often gets overridden. It's something that we'll often think we don't have time for. It's something that sometimes we might have beliefs going on internally that even equate that to being something that's bad, not allowed, not acceptable. If you think about some of the things I shared last time in terms of the mantra I learned in primary school that I gave as an example of what kept me in a state of fight or flight and not allowing myself to go to renewal. I learned that mantra, good, better, best. You will never rest until your good is better and your better best. So there might be things for you that you've been conditioned to believe about rest. You will never rest was mine. You might have believed that rest is evil or bad, or you need to be productive. So, like the opposite of rest is very much praised, and therefore rest isn't something that we've got time for because we need to be busy and productive. That's what's going to be rewarded in life. That's what's going to earn you the money, or that's what's going to gain you the sort of appreciation and um, the modern day equivalent of whatever merits or gold stars would have been when we were children. Now, if we were to stay in renewal for too long, of course, we would end up being depleted. So, anybody that's overslept, slept more than they needed the sleep, you maybe feel quite groggy and you actually feel depleted because you've had too much of a good thing. So it's all in balance that we need this. But when we have allowed ourselves to have sufficient rest, then we're able to access what I refer to as our optimum potential. And that is more of a high energy space. That's the kind of space that when we show up, we're able to engage others, we're able to communicate freely and easily, we're able to come up with ideas and creativity, we're able to be ourselves, and things feel more easeful in life. We trust in ourselves, we trust in others, we trust in life. Things go smoother for us. If we tip out of balance, if we're there for too long, we could find ourselves perhaps in fight or flight or find ourselves in depletion. And what we really want to get to used to doing is noticing the kind of signals, the signs and symptoms that our body will give us of when we're in those other zones, so that we can then choicefully come to renewal rather than overstaying in those other spaces and ending up finding ourselves in burnout, finding ourselves in that utter depletion. And of course, the better thing is to plan in renewal and ensure it happens, versus waiting for a warning sign to tell us we need it. So factoring it in and planning it in and holding it as something that's a priority rather than waiting to be reactive around it. But I'm hoping just by sharing this, it's maybe prompted some thinking in you and had you reflect a little bit on where are you? Where do you spend most of your time? What zone are you usually in? What happens when you're in one zone for too long? What might you want to do about that? The challenge in terms of how we spot burnout in other people and in ourselves. So how do we know when somebody is over in that zone of either high or low energy, but they're out of balance? Um, and the difficulty is, as we talked about last time, there are lots of internal and external stresses that will be contributing to people being out of balance. And it's not just an individual issue, it's a systemic one. So burnout is not an individual failing. It's when burnout is occurring, it's a sign that there's something in the system that's more often than not out of balance as well. And that's been demonstrated by and large now with the stats that are there evidencing that burnout it is really that we're at kind of a tipping point with it. It's no longer just the odd person here or there that is experiencing it, it's widespread. And there's still, despite the fact that burnout is being used as a term, despite the fact that we're quite casually often referring to it nowadays than we were, say, 10 years ago, there's still quite a lot of stigma that hangs around the term burnout. And many people will feel shame associated with burnout, and not want to verbalize it, not want to admit that they might be experiencing burnout. They might be shy to speak about it, not just for their own about themselves, but about their teams or about the workplace or the organization as a whole. So many organizations will shy away from actually addressing issues of burnout in their setting because they don't want other organizations to know that yes, we have got a toxic work culture here, or there's something out of balance. Um, and that's part of the problem. And we'll get into that in more depth and detail in the next session, which is all about burnout in the system. But whilst there is stigma there, it makes it harder for us to spot and address burnout with others that we work with, that we care about. And those of you that were here last time, we did a poll to find out how many of you have actually experienced burnout yourselves or someone close to you. And many people said that they had both experienced it themselves and so too had a loved one, a friend, family member, or a colleague. Now, if that's the case for you, you will most likely have also experienced the fact that the people closest to us, when they enter into burnout, um, they're more likely to be quite short fused and sort of snap at us than they do with other people that they don't know so well. So when it's in work, people will mask it quite well. It's usually outside of work that they're less able to. The guard comes down. They feel like they've got a bit of a kind of a well there of goodwill with their family and friends. You know, their family aren't, they'll make a presumption the family aren't going to go anywhere if they bite their heads off when, you know, really sadly, it can mean that families become estranged from each other, and it can also mean that relationships break down. Because imagine if you're having your head bit off every day by somebody who's out of balance, but they're showing up to work and they're keeping it all together at work, but then you bear the brunt of it back at home. So it can make for really difficult times when we're supporting people through burnout. But it can also mean when we're in a workplace setting, it's harder to spot because people will often do a good job in the workplace, at least, of masking that they are burning out. And if somebody at home dare ask, you know, and show concern and say, I think this seems like you're quite stressed a lot of the time. Do you think you might be burning out? No, no, what do you mean I'm stressed? I'm not stressed. So it can be really tricky to get through to the person who's on the edge of burnout but doesn't want to admit they're on the edge, is fearful maybe that they're at the edge and they don't really want to open their eyes to that. And because of that, it really then does creep up on us. And it can be, as I suggested last time, that all of a sudden we meet the point that we can't keep going and we can't go on. And I'm going to share a model that helps to also speak to that and bring that to life in just a moment. So, as I've alluded, there can be many contributing factors that feed into burnout. And we covered that in quite a lot of depth last time. One thing that I think is quite useful to consider when it comes to the concept of overextending ourselves, of giving bits of ourselves away, is this quote, which has really stayed with me since I first met it. And it was nearly 20 years ago now that I came across Anne Wilson-Schaef's work and this particular quote, and it really resonated for me. So I thought I would share it with you all in case it might also ring true for some of you. So Anne says, we are often so generous, especially with ourselves, that we give little pieces of ourselves away to almost anyone who asks. At the time, we hardly notice. Sometimes the pieces we give away are so minuscule that they really seem unimportant. We are unaware of the cumulative effect of years of giving away little bits and pieces of ourselves. When I first read that, I got sort of like goosebumps up and down my back. It suddenly made it clear to me how I had ended up in burnout, because it wasn't one big thing that resulted in me not being able to function anymore. And I think I shared about being bedridden for 6 months. It was the drip, 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 all of the build-up of little bits of myself that I gave to work, that I gave to friends, that I gave to family. And there's a saying that the way we do one thing is the way we do everything. And that was definitely true for me. And of course, culturally and societally, if the beliefs behind the giving ourselves away or the overdoing or the overextending or not being able to say no, if that's echoed by the spaces and the places that we work in, the groups we belong to, the education systems we've been raised in, then we forget who we are along the way because we've given so much of ourselves away. And we've noticed other people doing that too. So it's been again normalized. And so when I'm working with people as a coach, a lot of the focus of the work that I'm doing is recognizing what bits have been given away and what it would mean to bring those bits back again. And this work, when it comes to recovering ourselves from burnout or being close to burnout, it really is, it requires working to recover ourselves energetically, not just cognitively, not just physically, but the battery that we will have drained, it needs recharging again. Um, Now, I shared as well last week about the World Health Organization's definition for burnout. And it's really useful that the World Health Organization now recognizes burnout. And it has a huge focus on it being an occupational phenomenon. And in an overwhelming number of cases, it is the occupational aspect that tips people over the edge and can be part of the biggest sense of the contribution to burnout. And at the same time, there will be other things going on for people too. So it's not exclusively the fault of a workplace that somebody burns out. And in some factors, it might not even be the reason at all that somebody reaches burnout. But nonetheless, I think, especially in the profession that you are all, that's relevant to all of you as pathologists, it by and large in the studies that have been conducted, an overwhelming number of people suggested that their workplace experience has been one of the dominant factors in their burnout. And I'll speak more to that in the systemic session that we do next time. What I wanted to pull out was these three dimensions that I mentioned in the first session: exhaustion, job cynicism, and reduced efficacy. Because when it comes to spotting burnout in ourselves or in others, these three, uh, although they are the dimensions that are highlighted as being the key areas that we can identify burnout through, they're the ones that are often the most elusive and most difficult to spot. And I mentioned about this concept of people not knowing they're at burnout until they fall off like a cliff or they meet burnout up close and their bodies collapse on them. And very recently, Dr. Richard Duggins, who's an NHS psychiatrist and GP, uh, wrote a book called Burnout Free Working. And I interviewed him for my podcast, which is called The Art of Balance and is in the process of a rebrand. So it will also carry the same name as my book, Burnout to Brilliance, very soon. And he's very kindly gave his time for an interview for the next series, which will be released in the coming weeks. And part of his book describes burnout and this reality of this cliff that people meet whenever they've been keeping going. That battery hasn't had a chance to recharge. And all of a sudden, they experience a drop off. They just can't keep going anymore. And he describes the exhaustion as being something that's often masked. And the cynicism and the efficacy equally can be in this place of something of a plateau where others are not really able to spot that burnout's going out for someone because they don't even realize it's happening for themselves either. Or if they do suspect there's something there, they're really consciously covering it up because they don't want anyone else to find out, or because they're so fearful that they maybe aren't going to be able to sustain it for much longer. So they keep going and they keep going and they keep going until suddenly they just can't keep going anymore. And there's a dramatic drop then, a dramatic drop in in energy and being able to maintain oneself, so that that exhaustion just takes over. There may be cynicism, but it often doesn't actually become apparent until they've kind of fallen into the ravine. And that efficacy, that productivity, people can be meeting their targets and by all kind of intents externally everybody thinks, oh, that, they're fine. They're still, delivering everything we ask of them. They're going above and beyond. They're, until the point where they just absolutely cannot anymore, and they end up being off work because the body has stopped. And that can be as a result of a heart attack. It could be a stroke. It could be because they've crashed their car into a wall. It could be a blackout at a desk. It could be that they have a flu-like illness and simply can't bounce back from it. There's so many different ways that burnout can show up when it completely brings us down. Um, and then the recovery for many people can take quite a considerable amount of time, especially if we've had cycles of burnout over and over and over again. It just gets to a point where there's one big burnout that we just don't bounce back from. So although the recovery on this chart looks quite steep, it's as steep as the cliff of the drop off, it's not always a quick recovery back to the point before the burnout happened. Sometimes that, is a much slower hike up a longer hill to get to the top again. So it's not obvious because in terms of exhaustion, we've very much normalized people running on exhaust fumes. If you look anywhere today in marketing, you'll see, adverts for energy drinks, for coffee. We've got, quite a significant coffee culture, and I'm speaking from the UK, but around the world now, it's no longer something that was exclusive to pockets of places where coffee was something that was enjoyed as a, one a day treat. It's something that people are often fueling themselves on with multiple cups of coffee. We're big tea drinkers in the UK stereotypically, but now really caffeine has taken over. And in supermarkets, if you go into any standard supermarket in the UK, you'll see entire fridges devoted to energy drinks. And there's really quite alarming studies correlating the consumption of energy drinks, particularly in young men, with suicidal ideation, which is something that I mentioned about last week in relation to burnout and how some people find themselves really feeling quite desperate about how they're going to continue, and ideas around ending their lives coming in as being something that they hadn't experienced before until they found themselves not really knowing how they're going to keep going. Um, and so it's really quite worrying in terms of what we are normalizing in our culture, and especially for the younger generations, and the influence that the ingredients within these energy drinks have on our brain chemistry, especially on brains that are still forming. So for young men in their late teens and early 20s, who are the market that the place that the marketing is predominantly focused on, you know, their brains aren't fully developed. They're drinking these drinks that are really terrible for them internally, and the harm that is being done with those could be potentially irreversible as well, which I think is something really to be worried about generally. Um, so exhaustion is something we normalize not just with the things we go to substitute the energy we don't have, but also in terms of that fight or flight mode at the other end of the day, when we've been drinking caffeine all day to keep us going, we then can't switch off. We're tired but wired. When we're in fight or flight, we're releasing cortisol and adrenaline into our bloodstream. I mentioned last time about being, ready to fight off the tiger or run away from the lion, at our door. But when it comes to then being able to allow our system to settle from that and our nervous system to recover again, we can find it quite difficult to come back out of that. So many of us then will self-medicate and will reach for alcohol as a depressant to help our system to slow back down again and to numb us from the reality of the worry that we have, or that tired but wired feeling. And so we've got another issue going on at the other end of the day often, where we've normalized alcohol consumption. And again, being UK based, there's more that I read about on a day-to-day basis that's UK influence, but it is a broader issue. For some countries, it's more nicotine than alcohol. So Greece, for example, it's more of a nicotine addiction that will be developing for people as a way of switching off. And again, that being culturally normalized. And in some cases, it's cannabis consumption as another way of depressing the system. And recent studies have shown that people are more likely to reach for things like that to self-medicate from the symptoms of going towards burnout than they are to go and seek medical advice, to go speak to their GP, for example. Um, Now, if people are masking exhaustion, that's one thing. With the cynicism, I alluded that sometimes people, of course, don't feel cynical and there isn't a resentment that builds up. They reach burnout and they're still feeling like they want to engage with work and they're not necessarily blaming anybody for their burnout or even they're not beating themselves up about it either. But for those that are, for the people that do end up feeling really quite frustrated and disconnected and emotionally distanced, that is often, as I say, quite well masked until the point where they fall off that cliff. And then that's where they experience it. So they might give this professional appearance where, they're all for the thing that they're doing, and wouldn't say anything untoward until the point where they're at the cliff, and in that ravine. And that's when you often find that people will leave the workplace altogether, or they could become quite toxic in an environment because they feel as though everything's against them and that they're powerless to do anything about it. Um, the more positive way that things can come as a result of burnout is when somebody's able to regain their energy and they care about the organization, they care about the work that they're doing, and they want to address the issue and make amends with things. But it's very difficult often to come back from burnout really recharged and fueled and ready to make that change. And that's something that we'll speak about in the next session as well. And then in terms of productivity, as I say, the drop in performance might not be visible or it might be going on, but it's only very micro. And so it's invisible still externally. Um, and the biggest sort of sign of productivity having dropped is the person that's no longer able to be there in doing the work that they were doing, or the person that's there doing the work, but they've kind of checked out and they're not really contributing, and that can happen, but in many cases it's less of the issue. So, before we get into a pause for self-reflection on this, I thought I would outline the next few slides that we're going to cover around how do we spot it. If it's really difficult and if it's masked so well and it's hidden so well, what do we do about this then? How can we identify burnout? So I'm going to initially speak to how we can develop more self-awareness, because I'm a big believer in the saying that we can only meet others to the depth that we've met ourselves. We can only really support others and spot things in others and see things when we ourselves have noticed it for ourselves, about ourselves, and considered how might we do something about that for ourselves as well. I'll then move into what the more subtle signs are and how you might notice them, how we can create spaces for real conversations. So, say you have spotted something about somebody, how then do you broach that with them, especially if there's still stigma surrounding burnout and people being anxious to admit to it. And there are some industries and professions where it's become the new badge of honor. Busyness used to be the thing that people kind of, um, you know, took pride in. Oh yeah, I'm so busy. Oh yeah, I'm slammed. Now it's like, well, yeah, I burned out. I burned out early. I am back again, and then it's almost, especially in the professional services industry, it's become a new thing to boast about. But in the majority of places, it's still something that people are hesitant to admit because they might see it as a personal failing, even though it isn't. And that's something I want to make loud and clear with this series. So then we'll be talking about how to lead with empathy and emotional awareness and have these difficult conversations so that we can support others to give themselves permission to look after themselves, to do the thing that they might need, and how we can care for each other in our workplace settings, especially when systems aren't necessarily set up or have cultures have become normalized where we are demanding and expecting too much of people. How do we collectively then advocate for balance and bring that back? And that's what we're going to in the next session in a big way. And then so finally, spotting patterns that signal systemic stress. So in terms of developing more self-awareness, let's consider that together. Um, how might you recognize your own stress responses and how they show up? How might you notice early signals of overload? Within each of us, there will be whispers before our body starts to shout at us. And I often think on them a bit like a dashboard in a car. We'll get an early warning light will come on to let us know when we're starting to run out of fuel, for example. But if we were to keep an eye on that dashboard, we could see when we're at three quarters, we can see when we're at half a tank. And I actually often, when I'm asked to give tips for magazines or on a radio interview or something, I'll suggest to people to experiment with filling their car up when it gets to halfway or three quarters, rather than waiting until it goes down to a quarter of a tank or less than that and the lights come on. And to use that as a nudge to themselves, to refuel themselves. So allowing some of the things externally in our environment to remind us, to prompt us to consider, and how is my energy? And have I refueled myself today? What am I doing for myself and my own energy tank in this moment? So paying attention to when our capacity feels depleted or stretched or compressed. What are the little things that you've got to know about yourself just before you get a headache? What is the sign that you're maybe heading towards one? What happens before you're about to get a cold? What would happen? What would make a difference if you did something for yourself at that point to re-energize, to boost yourself? You get the early night, you gargle the salt, you take some ginger, rather than thinking, oh, I think that feels like I've got a cold coming on, or I'll have another glass of wine and go to bed after I've watched a few Netflix episodes. Um, what might you be able to make space for that you're not currently, in terms of reflecting, rather than waiting till that warning light is there? And then how might you build more empathy for yourself so that you are more able to be empathetic with others, rather than responding sort of knee-jerk reactions to people. They come at you because they're stressed and depleted. You respond from a place of your own stress and depletion. There's tension, there's collision, things feel unpleasant. Um, so we're going to pause just for a moment, and give you an opportunity to consider, when you are under strain, what stress response are you most aware of? Do you typically become aware when you're under stress of going into a fight mode, which is that irritability, a sense of urgency, everything needs to be done now, it can't wait, pushing harder, like pushing through? You might notice in the language you use with yourself, oh, look at your diary, you think, God, I've got so much going on today, and just keep pushing it through, just keep pushing through. What do you tell yourself when you're under stress? How gentle are you with yourself? Or on the flip side, how harsh are you? I recognized at the stage when I had burned out and was reflecting after, that I was somewhat of a sort of slave driver to myself. It was like I was kept cracking a whip and expecting so much of myself. There was no gentleness, there was no pause, there was no considering, how I really felt, or, why I would matter in an equation. It was all about giving, 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 doing, doing, doing. If it's flight mode, then it might show up in procrastination. So you might look at that day ahead, and instead of the push through, it might be about, oh, well, I'll just do this thing and then I'll do that thing. But the thing that really is going to make the difference, you put it off and you put it off. Or you might find yourself withdrawing from people and places. And quite often that'll show up in, say, cancelling things in calendars, whether that's meetings, or things with friends and family at the weekend. Essentially, sort of pulling back, the you that you usually brought to things, you just can't bring to things anymore. Freeze shows up often with the foggy thinking, the slowing down, the stalling, and fawn with the overhelping, the over accommodating, the difficulty saying no. So just pausing for a moment, you might want to look out the window and think about this. You might want to make notes or doodle. We're going to take the slides down and bring up the Slido. You might like to type it in somewhere because that might help you to work it out as you write it. Um, you might also feel like you don't really know. You actually can't quite get a compass read on this for yourself yet. That's okay too. Or maybe it's a mixture of all of those things that you're identifying. So, what we, when we get to know ourselves better, when we start to recognize how things change in a subtle way for ourselves, and just as somebody shared in the chat, colleagues around have commented on something, that's really brilliant that our colleagues would be able to share that with us. That is an indication of trust in a relationship. And being able to receive feedback like that without going to defense mode, often that needs trust. So this is where our relationships around us are so important when it comes to actually preventing burnout, to supporting each other, to creating cultures of care. Um, and so when we start to notice subtle signs in others, it will be in small changes. So noticing the person that is needing to say the things out loud and they wouldn't normally, noticing the person who's requesting to go and sit somewhere else away from everybody because they can't concentrate otherwise. But that wasn't a place that that's something that they used to have to do. And it might be, of course, that they've just suddenly recognized about themselves that, oh, I wish I'd been asking for this thing all along, and that's different. But just being aware, being curious, and having conversations with people that show that you care, not that you're judging, not that you're diagnosing, but you're creating a space where somebody can maybe make contact with stress for themselves and know that they've got support around them to to consider doing something differently in order to respond to that and to bring that balance back for themselves. So noticing the patterns that might be there, noticing shifts in energy, being aware that some people will really mask. And so you might presume that somebody isn't struggling because they're meeting all the targets and getting everything done, but actually behind the scenes they might be. So building that into, if you're a leader, or a manager and you're doing appraisals for people, for example, rather than looking at, okay, you're meeting this, this, and this, what more can we get out of you? Like, how can we stretch you? What might be the thing that you are not yet, challenging yourself with that we could bring in? Instead, saying, wow, you're meeting all of these things, and I want to check, how has that been for you? Is that sustainable for you? Versus presuming that there's more that they can be doing or giving. How do we keep it then in a place that feels balanced? How would you feel about letting me know if you were finding it a struggle to meet all of these targets? Would you feel comfortable with bringing that to me? And I mean, maybe they wouldn't tell you if they didn't feel comfortable, but at least you're asking the question. So the next time they might say, and they might build a bit more trust to feel like, well, I wonder if I did bring this to my manager, maybe they would hold that for me and explore that with me, even if they didn't know how to solve it. Well, at least I'm being able to name it, and that in itself can lessen stress. So the other thing is, and I just kind of, I guess, want to emphasize this. And similarly, when you might seek support outside of the workspace, if you were feeling overly stressed, somebody in the role of a manager or a leader, or even somebody that you might work with, like a coach, it's not for them to diagnose something, but having an awareness of this helps us to ask questions that might support the person in front of us to better understand themselves and to better understand their nervous system responses and what they might need to better recalibrate themselves. So these conversations, often when we try and have them from a very cognitive place, can become really headache inducing. So it can be really helpful to bring in metaphors that will give people a way of describing how they're actually doing. Whenever I work with organizations with teams that have identified that they've kind of all got used to responding to each other in a certain way that keeps them stuck in burnout collectively, I will encourage them to start checking in before meetings with how they're actually really feeling so that they can name things for themselves. And they might do that through saying what the weather is like in their head. as something kind of abstract, but that allows the body to speak rather than the mind to try and work it out. So it might be that you ask people, so if you were checking in, like with what the weather's like in your head, how are you arriving to today, to this meeting? Or to name the thing that might get in the way of them being able to concentrate for that meeting. Or if they were arriving and describing themselves as an animal coming into the meeting, what animal would describe the way they're arriving? And then people might say, "Oh, I'm arriving like a cheetah, and I feel like I've been running, running, running all day long, and I'm running in the door now." That gives you an indication. Okay, maybe they might be feeling a bit like they're in fight or flight, but it could also be that they're in their optimum space and they're just, breezing on in. So not making presumptions, but just asking, noticing what you notice in your body as they describe the animal. Is it an exhausted cheetah that keeps having to run everywhere? Or is it that they're in their prime as that cheetah arriving? Are they arriving as a sloth? Do they usually come in places like a sloth? If not, like just being aware of that sloth-likeness, and by attuning to people and acknowledging people and where they're at, that in itself helps us to be more authentically as we are and to make accommodations for people based on how they're at, rather than just jumping into what needs to get done and who's doing it. And before we know it, we're just robots basically pushing through a day rather than humans responding to humans. I think it's quite often when useful when we've become, especially again relating to the UK and the sort of colloquialisms that we have around how are you. I lived in Japan for 3 years, and I remember it being quite evident that it had translated to the Japanese education system, that this phrase "How are you?" in England didn't really mean anything. It didn't really mean "How are you?" It was just a stock hello, because they were taught to respond to "How are you?" with "I'm fine, thank you," and you. And there was no other real option other than "I'm fine, thank you, I'm you and you," because they just thought that was what that exchange meant. It had been lost in translation that actually asking "How are you?" meant, you know, what's the weather like in your head? What animal are you arriving as? But that's because we've had it conditioned out of us. It's not really been lost in translation. That is how British people often meet each other and exchange with each other. We'll often say, "How are you?" We don't really listen to the response. So the person just says, "Oh yeah, I'm fine," or "I'm okay," or "Yeah, I'm good." But they don't really mean the thing that comes out of their mouth at all, because you've not really meant "How are you?" when you've asked it. It's just become a bit of an exchange, a transactional level exchange. So, to make the difference with that, if you are asking someone, "How are you?" and they give the stock response that you're used to hearing, then ask again, "How are you really?" And just notice what happens, whether there's a deeper level of response, whether the mask maybe comes down a little and somebody is vulnerable enough to be able to share, "Well, actually, I've had a really shit morning and I'm feeling exhausted," or "I'm worried about my daughter and that's kept me up all night," or "I've lost my dog and I don't know where he's gone and that's bothering me," or "I've just discovered that my colleague's been diagnosed with cancer and I'm absolutely in shock at the moment." Like, people will maybe start to share that little bit more about themselves that helps you to then be able to empathize and care. But again, we can only empathize and care if we ourselves have the capacity to do that, because we're looking after and attuning to our own need to empathize to ourselves, for ourselves, and care for ourselves too. But when we do listen and when we do go deeper and when we really ask with sincerity and really listen, not just to the words that come, but with our whole bodies to what we respond, to what we receive in response, then we start to deepen trust. We start to build rapport, and people then start to feel safer about being vulnerable with us. And that's where change can really start to come in. And again, we'll build on that next time when we speak about systemic change. So, in terms of being able to listen and being able to lead with listening, it comes down to this word empathy and to our own awareness, being present and being grounded in ourselves when we ask. So, pausing for a moment and taking a breath is an incredibly powerful tool that we all have on board that we kind of forget that we have. many people that I work with will have become so used to breathing very shallowly up in the top of their body that they've forgotten how to breathe in the way that they did when they were babies. You know, if any of you've got a baby or been around babies, you might notice that when they sleep, their bellies rise and fall. And that's because we instinctively, when we came into this world, knew how to breathe. And we breathed fully and deeply. And we allowed ourselves to restore and to replenish through our breath. But because of the pace of life, because of all the hurrying and the busyness, we forget to breathe. So we end up breathing shallow as we rush around our day. And if we take moments, micro pauses through the day to breathe, especially before we're asking somebody, how are you? Especially before we start a meeting, especially before we're about to deliver something, and ground ourselves and bring that presence of being back to our body so that we're not just a head on a stick. You know, we're actually a whole body with multiple brains, not just the one in our head, but our stomach as our brain, our heart as a brain, you know, noticing how we actually feel, what we're actually experiencing of ourselves and of others when we're in presence with them. It changes things, it shifts things, it helps us to build psychological safety and trust with those that we work with. So when it comes to spotting burnout in our teams, if we're able to ground ourselves more, breathe more, and be in that place in ourselves when we're, you know, consciously coming into contact with others and wondering about how they're doing, when we're in that place in us, we're better able to then regulate the other person too. We need regulated people to help us to regulate. When we can't find another regulated person to help us to find that place in ourselves, then nature, you know, as in we are nature, of course, but being outside in nature with trees, water, the wind, you know, other other regulated aspects of nature, whether that's the pets we have at home or the birds in the trees, you know, those things can help us to find that reference point inside ourselves too. But we need to find it, otherwise we can't really help others around us if we haven't found it in ourselves. So when we're better able to ground ourselves and be attuned in ourselves, we can then also better notice patterns. So there will be things that occur in other people, the habits they have, you know, whether that's always eating at their desk, whether that's jumping in and finishing other people's sentences, whether that's withdrawing at a certain time of the day or of the week, or when a certain projects undergo. What are the patterns you start to notice with teams as a whole? Maybe there's moments where everybody would benefit from a pause, but instead you reach the goal with something and you're straight on to the next thing. You know, think like the seasons. Don't skip autumn and winter and simply try and force people through spring and to stay in summer. You know, allowing for pauses after things so people can get their breath again, they can gather themselves again, and noticing where these patterns are, you know, where it's something that was maybe for a one-off. I mentioned the pandemic and how boundaries really blurred at that time, especially in your profession. You know, noticing where we need to bring things back to where they were before that occurred. Where have we forgotten what normal did used to look like, and where have we continued to make things part of how we do things, but actually it's really not sustainable and the cracks are now starting to show. So our team is often a barometer, um, or the individuals in teams are a barometer for how the team is as a whole. It won't just be going on for one person. If you are experiencing it yourself, most likely others around you are too. So bringing this into conversations, raising awareness, talking about this webinar, sharing it so others can access it, signposting people to resources. Quite often when people ask me, how can I bring this up with someone that's close to me because they are going to just bite my head off, I often say, well, buy a book like Burnout to Brilliance or like Richard Duggan's book, Burnout Free Working, leave it around to see if people might it might catch the corner of their eye, they might lift it up and they might find what they need for themselves by themselves without you being the one that tells them, I think you need this. Sometimes we can bring things in just that little bit more casually or subtly, but role modeling things rather than telling, because if we say one thing and then we do another, that doesn't, it's never picked up by anybody else. So I'm going to move into this seven domains of burnout. I mentioned earlier this concept of your dashboard and how you'll have warning lights that will come on a dashboard to help you to recognize the things that you need to pay attention to. And burnout, we've predominantly talked about it through cognitive functioning, physical functioning, and a little bit on behavior. But what we haven't really looked at is other ways that burnout can also be spotted, both in ourselves and others. So there's less well known, less commonly talked about areas where burnout will start to show itself. And those exist in our emotional capacities in the environments around us. And then also, as I've started to tiptoe into sort of our energy, but also our ability to know things about situations, our gut feelings, our intuition, that inner sort of navigation that we have that often is the thing that guides us to decide, do I really want to be friends with this person? Do I actually want that job? It's very rarely only about the logical black and white, what's on paper. It's usually more, there's something else that gives us the knowing, but that starts to switch off when we're burning out. So I'm going to go into an overview of each of these, and the slides will be available and the recording beyond the session, so you can always go back to this. So cognitively, whenever our brain is under chronic stress, so remembering it's that cumulative build up, it's not just fleeting moments of pressure, but it's that when the pressure is daily, when it's ongoing, when there's no let up to it, then our executive functioning and our creative capacity will start to shut down. So, what that means when it starts to show up is you might really find that you're the person that usually came up with creative solutions. You're the person that helped people to see different perspectives. You were the one that maybe made decisions on things, or Kate, were able to, like a bit of like a walking encyclopedia, pull facts and figures or reference points about things out. And if that was what you were usually really strong in, and then all of a sudden you just can't grasp those things, then that can be a sign of burnout. And I mentioned before in the first series about how there will be this sort of midlife collision often. So some of you will start thinking, well, hang on a minute, that sounds like menopause, or that's very similar to andropause. And of course, those things can be happening at the same time. So you might see correlations when I go through these domains around menopause, andropause, also around neurodivergence, because when we are under strain and under pressure and not able to mask or to regulate our nervous systems, these things become even more obvious and difficult for us, and we start to get more of these signs and symptoms. So when our cognitive functioning is struggling, we'll often also get lapses in memory. We can misplace information that we would have otherwise usually had accessible to us. And we can feel like our thinking is slowed, when usually we were maybe quite quick thinking as individuals. So that's how it shows up cognitively. And this, remember, isn't for everybody. We'll all have different aspects of these things, but for those of us that experience cognitive struggle, this is how you might see that. Then behaviorally, when we go into survival mode, it's often like it means that we will start to blur boundaries. We will do things that aren't really healthy for us. So it might show up through working longer hours. It might be about withdrawing from colleagues, and not because that was something that was a previous preference, but because we simply don't have the energy to give people anymore, even though we really enjoy being around people, even though we might sort of typically gravitate to people and find that that usually is a bit of a catalyst for energy for us, would start to find that actually, no, I just can't cope with anyone or anything, and that includes people. So of course, some people will never want to be around people anyway. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about those that usually enjoyed kind of social interaction. Um, and of course, some people will have had a preference for a certain amount of interaction with people, and they might have overridden that because they've taken a job that requires them to do too much social interaction for them and for their system. And so they might have been masking and showing up and being like out and about all of the time. And then they just can't do that anymore. So there was a period in my life, for example, again, it was actually when I lived in Japan, where I was delivering day in, day out um, sessions, like learning sessions, English learning sessions. But I had kind of turned them into almost like a kind of Butlins entertainment show. And although I enjoyed doing them, and although I come to life when I'm on a stage and performing, it's an aspect that I enjoy, I don't enjoy doing it all of the time. And I was demanding it of myself. Other people weren't really demanding it of me. I chose to be a kind of exuberant, energetic teacher rather than I could have opted and done what some of my co-workers done and read from a textbook or kind of set more slow and quieter tasks and wandered around or just sat in the corner more, but I didn't, and I set a bar for myself that I then had to maintain, and so I got exhausted from doing that. Now I've recognized that I can balance things, so I can still do some of the on-stage entertainment, like this session, for example, or if I do something on an actual stage, but I couldn't do that every single day, all day, or I would burn out. So I have to balance things with a mix. So for some people, in terms of that behavior, they might actually really enjoy certain things, but they just do too much of it and then they withdraw from it altogether. There might be procrastination, as I mentioned earlier, avoidance of things that require shifting lots of gears when normally they could do that with ease, or maybe they could do that, and if they made themselves do it, but actually underneath it all, they would have benefited from less gear shifting, and they were just overriding that because it's what the job demanded of them. So they might have had a preference for doing one thing one day, a different thing another day, another thing another day, and all of a sudden with burnout, it's like I can't do any of it. And then they learn about themselves. Actually, if I set up my week differently, if I set up my day differently, it's more easeful for my own individual wiring and preferences. Um, and so the behavior can change as a result of overdoing it in that respect. They might pull away from things they actually love, hobbies and activities they enjoy. Self-care can become neglected. So, sometimes people will find that they will have been quite well presented, typically have been the person that brushed their teeth, did their hair, maybe put certain combinations of clothes on and things until they just feel like I can't even be bothered to brush my teeth. I've not bothered getting my hair cut or, whatever it was that they usually maintain for themselves. And this isn't about, a right or a wrong with that, but just how they would have usually been for themselves, not for other people. And quite often a telltale sign, unless someone loves black clothes and dark clothes exclusively, and that might be their preference, and that's, different to what I'm stressing. Quite a lot of people will default to almost their own uniform that they create for themselves, and it will be all quite black, colors. When actually there was someone that liked to express themselves through wearing different colors and choosing different things to wear, but because they're burning out, they just don't have the energy to put together what they want to wear, to think about what color they might like. And it's like all of the color drains out of them and their life in general, and it shows up physically through their clothes choices, which is something that people don't typically talk about or think about. I talked about boundaries, being difficult to say no. The reliance on substances to help them get through is another behavioral sign. Emotionally, when our reserves are depleted and that empathy cup gets emptied out, our resilience begins to wane. And so you might end up noticing feeling detached, irritable, as I've mentioned, or emotionally really flat. it's difficult to be empathetic about other people. You just simply get to sit, well, I don't really care anymore. Just do what you like. You might have had quite clear boundaries, for example, with your children around use of tech or how long they're allowed to stay with a certain friend or doing a certain thing. But because you're so tired, so drained, you think, oh, whatever. Yeah, have another hour on TikTok or whatever it is. But really, you do care. It's just you don't have the energy to hold that boundary around something with somebody else. We can become really sensitive, a heightened sensitivity. Some of us will be naturally very sensitive in general to certain things, to light, to textures, to smells, um, to tastes of things, textures of food, and what can happen not just with our own sensory acuity in terms of how we navigate each day and the things that we have around us, but also to criticism or conflict, anything that means that we need to sort of ground and stay grounded and balanced in ourselves. We can find ourselves unable to do that, so it just all becomes really overwhelming and too much. I might find that being around certain people that we could previously tolerate, we simply can't anymore. We can't maybe take the weight of their emotional baggage that we'd normally hold or listen to or support with, because we just don't have the capacity in ourselves for ourselves, and therefore we're not able to give it or do it for others. And if we've felt like we've been siphoned energetically by others, we can't support that anymore. And that links a bit with the energetic bit that I'll come to in a second. So, as a result of that, emotionally, we can then find ourselves a bit all over the place and we might end up being more tearful than usual. And I'm not talking about menopause here, and I'm not talking about, the menstrual cycle either, because of course some of us will find a lot of this will apply due to our hormonal changes. But this is when it's happening outside of that, not just within that experience, and for people of all genders as well. So it's not just about, those of us that would experience these things because of menstrual cycles. And essentially, what can happen because of all of that, and I spoke a little bit to this last time at the very extreme extent, the feeling of I just don't care anymore might not just be about I don't care about doing the washing or I don't care about what we have for dinner, but it can be I don't care about my work, I don't care about my life, and starting to feel that they might want to opt out. Physically, our body, when it's experiencing the toll of exhaustion, we can notice fatigue that lasts even when we've been to bed and slept. So even when we've had a rest, we still wake up tired. We might wake up feeling as though we've done a workout when we've not been at the gym for months. So we might get really tense muscles. It could be around our necks, our shoulders, our backs. It might even be in our legs. So chronic pain can start to appear in our bodies, seemingly for no reason. But it's our body saying you're holding on too long. You need to release. Something needs to let go. And if we listen and we, attune to that, then our bodies can be brought back from that edge of the cliff. But if we override it, then that is where we end up heading towards. Our bodies will give us signs through headaches, through skin conditions that will flare up, through colds that we can't shift, through difficulty with digestion, heartburn, maybe irritable bowel syndrome. All sorts of things can show up physically for us. Sleep was something I spoke about significantly last time, either difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep. Heart palpitations. I've lost track now of the number of clients have said how they've thought they were having a heart attack. They've gone to A&E, they've run tests, and they haven't had a heart attack, but the body nonetheless is saying, stop, this is all too much. You're moving too fast. Slow things down. So then environmentally, this is the thing that quite often will surprise people is how things will manifest around them when our inner world is feeling depleted. There's like a mirroring effect that can happen externally because we just can't keep on top of things anymore. So plants that we usually kept alive and flourishing will start to die. Things that we usually kept, things in their place and they were organized, those things end up feeling unmanageable. And I'm not talking about people that like to live with stuff in place, around them because that helps them. I'm talking about those that usually had an order to things and that helped them. Everything in balance, remember, not to the extreme. But all of a sudden, they're not managing that anymore. And things that were tasks that once felt manageable suddenly don't. Stuff stacks up. And that can be physically, but it can also be digitally. So many files and things. Think about inboxes being flooded. It can turn up with the cars that start breaking down because we've forgotten to maintain them. The stuff that we don't repair around the home, and then all of a sudden there's a big problem around us physically in our environment as well as in our own selves. So whenever we do end up in a place in ourselves where we're drained, quite often we'll describe how we feel as being a bit like a zombie or kind of ghost-like. You might notice around you other people start to look a bit grey, as if you could almost put your hand through them. They're just not there anymore. And there's a place that some people will experience that isn't depression. Depression can go hand in hand with burnout, but it doesn't apply in all cases to everybody. So you can burn out and not feel depressed. But quite often, some people will sit in a kind of place of meh. It's known as anhedonia. And there's a phenomenal book that Tanith Carey has written on this topic for those of you that are interested in learning a bit more about it, which is called Feeling Blur, BLAH. And it speaks about this zone of grey merness, which is not quite depression, but it's definitely not joy. And it's like the joy in things, the pleasure that you used to get, is just not there anymore. So even when you do the thing that you think might refuel you, you don't get anything from it. And that's a really strong sign that something really needs to change. And I mentioned earlier about how you can be feeling exceptionally drained by other people as well. So then in the intuitive sense, we can find it really hard to get these gut feelings that would normally help us to make decisions, help us to trust, help us to know what to let go of. So we end up overthinking, second guessing. It can be really hard then to connect with people at a deeper level. We start to feel like, what's the point with the work that we were doing that we were maybe feeling quite fulfilled with before? So we lose our sense of purpose and we generally start to feel out of sync with ourselves and our values. Value misalignment can also often be something that can lead to burnout if somebody's feeling like the organizational values and their own values behind the scene are a mismatch. And when we do that for too long, we stop trusting ourselves. So the intuition that we're normally able to access just doesn't come through for us anymore. So another moment to breathe, to pause, to see what you are taking from this for yourself. What's really standing out to you the most right now? What does that mean for you as a manager or a leader? What does that mean for your team? And with the recognizing that, what might you then do differently as a result? So what might you do about that? So that the next session we'll be thinking about shared accountability and how the system design really does need re-engineering and it needs consideration and that we need to meet that in whatever way we can ourselves and take responsibility for that change. We can't wait for others to do it for us, but we can only do that if we filled our own cup. So it really does require us looking after ourselves and not in a selfish, narcissistic way. This isn't about becoming self-absorbed and self-obsessed and, only caring about ourselves and nobody else. It's about caring for yourself so you can continue to care for others and recognizing that, you really do need to look after you because then you can lead by example and then you have the energy to challenge what needs to be challenged and to advocate for change. It means you can be more authentic. You can mean what you say and say what you mean rather than pussyfooting around things or pretending things are okay when really they're not, or hiding things. So it really is about people starting to be more transparent, more open, more honest, more vulnerable, which means more trust will generate in the places that we work. And we will be able to rebuild things and recreate things and find solutions to things. Because if we all look after ourselves enough to get to that place where we can rework things, then things can be done very, very differently. But we won't get there if we're all too exhausted. We'll just run all of ourselves collectively into the ground and it will be, the collapse of many organizations and things. And that maybe what's needed in some instances, but wouldn't it be great if we could prevent that, by taking some of this on board and spreading the word around it and doing something about it? So, noticing what you can do for you. And I often invite people to think about themselves as if they were a shed. To get a reference, that might sound a little out there and a little odd, but if you were to imagine yourself as a shed, play with it. What does your shed look like? What is the roof like? What are the sides of the shed like? Does it have a door? What kind of base does it have? Is there anything inside your shed? What about around your shed? As a metaphor, remember I said about like, if we try and cognitively get there, we can't. So using metaphors can help our body to go, okay, I can feel into this. I can start to access a knowing about this. So when you conceive of a shed, either in your mind's eye, if you're quite visual, or in your body, if you can kind of like feel a shed, like how shed-like, what's your shed? Is it like a shed that can just very easily blow over in the wind? Has it got rotten bits? Is it full of clutter? Is it clean on the outside but really dirty on the inside? Like, is it really well structured and maintained and looked after? Like, how is your shed if you conceive of yourself as a shed? And that will give you hints through your body's knowing, through your mind's eye, as to what condition you are in generally and what needs a bit of TLC, what needs repair, what needs a lick of paint, what needs beautifying, what could benefit with some nurturing. Perhaps you need some flowers around your shed. Perhaps you need to declutter your shed. Perhaps it needs a new roof. What is it you're needing? Maybe it's the foundations. Maybe you recognize your shed's been built on sand and actually you need to do a bit of deeper work around loving yourself, accepting yourself, caring for yourself, the beliefs that might have got in the way of that. I use a shed not just as a metaphor to help you to recognize and take stock on how are you actually, but also as a metaphor for very basic things that can help bring us back to life. They're so basic and so obvious that we often think surely that's too simple. That can't really make a difference. I spoke about sleep last time. The other things are hydration. So challenging any of the habits that I've reeled off that you might find you relate to. What happens if you do drink water and mainly water and not Diet Coke and Red Bull and coffee and whatever else you're putting in? What happens if you ditch the alcohol at the end of the day? With support, if there's an actual addiction and problem there, I'm not suggesting going cold turkey. If you have noticing that you've got a real dependency on alcohol, please seek professional support. But where you feel you've normalized the use of alcohol and actually having it every single day is not good for you, or having it, every other day, what might happen if you were to experiment with more water going in and less of the stuff that your liver has to work so hard to flush out? What happens if you built in more movement? It doesn't need to be going to the gym or going on runs or doing a couch to 5K in the next few weeks, but moving your body, taking small micro breaks can make such a difference for ourselves, and eating the things that we know are best for us versus going to the things that are our crutches. And it takes time building these in, but they make a massive difference. And I mentioned about seeking support in terms of substances that we might have brought in and be depending on, but the support doesn't need to wait to something extreme is really needing significant support. Support can start with asking for small bits of help or seeking help for ourselves. So, maybe one of the books that's been mentioned today or the podcast I mentioned today, finding out what's there maybe in your organization. Employee assistance programs are usually quite underutilized and people don't even really know what they've got access to. Seeking out support of a certified burnout coach or working with a counselor or a psychotherapist who has experience in burnout prevention and recovery. All of talk therapists have got specialisms. So find one that really understands this material that I've been taking you through today. If you think actually those foundations of my shed, I'd like to figure out what's there, what has been supporting me so far that's useful and I want to keep, and what bits aren't really that useful. The mantras that I mentioned that I had that really were leading me nowhere but to ruin. Let's See what happens if I let go of those and form better beliefs for myself. Honor the values. What even are your values? Do you know? That's where a talk professional could support you. There are also some fabulous peer group supports, community support groups. If you look out and around, you'll find people and places and spaces because there is a mental health crisis at the moment. There are many people like yourself feeling magnetized to topics like this because of the struggle that's going on. But equally, there are places and spaces appearing everywhere now to help people through because it is something we all need to get through together. You might discover in some of the decluttering that actually you could do with clearing out not just your physical space, but also, looking at your finances, looking at some of the things that you've neglected that other specialists might be able to help you with. And there are lots of ways you can access things like that that don't necessarily cost money or are low cost. So books and podcasts can be a great way into things, but there are lots of charities providing support with things too. It's not just an option of sort of private funding or waiting on an NHS waiting list forever. So see what might be out there by having a look if that feels resonant for you. You don't have to do it alone. So thank you so much for being here today. It did feel important to just wrap up with those last couple of things.